So a lot of you have asked me about my method for tuning up dado planes. I've talked about it on the podcast. I've mentioned it in the blog before, I think, but I haven't done a video on it, and a lot of you have been asking me for a video. So that's what we're going to do today. So for those of you that aren't familiar with dado planes are meant for creating dados. And a dado really is nothing more than a groove that runs across the grain of a board. The dado planes have a few special features that allow them to make these joints cleanly without tearing out across the grain. The first, it has 2 irons instead of 1. The front iron is what we call a scoring iron, and that has 2 small ears on either side, or 2 small blades on either side. It's forked, and the sides of the iron cut the sides of the dado. They score it across the grain nice and cleanly so that you get a good clean cut. Second, the second blade in the back, the main cutting blade, which peels the material out of the bottom of the dado, is skewed. So this blade, the mouth of this is skewed. The blade is not square to the sole of the plane, it's actually at an angle. And that helps to create a shearing cut that cleans the material out of the bottom of the dado much more cleanly and efficiently than a straight iron would. And finally, dado planes typically have a depth stop. And this is so that you can set this and the plane will stop cutting when it gets to a predetermined depth. Now these could be a little bit challenging to tune up, but I have a method that I think should make it pretty easy and allow you to get decent results from just about any dado plane, and that's what I want to talk about today. So I want to start by assessing the condition of the plane, the current condition. To do this, I want to take the plane apart. We're going to take all the blades out and the wedges. Check the depth stop. See that it moves freely. This one is good. May need to be cleaned up a little bit, but it moves freely, so that's good enough. If it doesn't move freely, you may have to either file down, try to get the depth stop out, and file down the metal parts, or you might have to take a rasp or a chisel and pare down the inside of the mortise just to get it a little bit, give it a little bit more room to move around. And if it binds up, it's likely because the wood has shrunk around the metal part of the depth stop. You can usually take them out simply by completely unscrewing the mechanism. And again, this might be a little bit difficult depending on your specific depth stop, but you can see they simply come out like that. And there's a couple of screws in the top. You could try to take those out if you wanted to. I might do that later. I'm not going to worry about it right now. So the next thing I want to do is I want to assess how straight the body is. So I'm going to check with a straight edge. This one's not too bad. It does look like it has a very slight bow. So it's a little bit convex on this side, and it's a little bit concave on this side. And that's probably going to translate into some concavity here along the area where the dado is going to be made as well. But this is so slight that I'm just going to let it go. If it was severely out, or out enough that it might make a difference, you've got a couple of choices. You can plane the sides of the plane down. So you would want to plane this side to get it straight. And then you're going to want to use a rabbet plane or a shoulder plane and plane this part of the plane here. This doesn't really matter because it's not going to reference off of anything. But this is going to define the width of your dado. And this side of the plane here is going to ride up against a batten or fence to create the dado. So it's important that this side be fairly flat and that this side be fairly flat as well to keep the dado from binding, to keep the plane from binding in the cut. This plane is not out of flat enough that I'm going to bother with it. So I can move on to the next step, and that's going to be to address the scoring iron. Now, most scoring irons, most dado planes, when you get them, they will come with a scoring iron that is ground so that the blade itself angles back. It angles from the front of the plane towards the back of the plane. And the reason for this is that the common recommendation is to take the plane when you're going to create a dado, put it up against your batten that you're going to use. Let's say, you would put a piece of wood here, but let's just use the clamp for now, the square for now, as our batten. And you would then take the plane and drag it backwards this way. And what that would do is, if this scoring iron is adjusted, when you take that plane and drag it backwards along the fence, I didn't clamp it, so obviously it's going to be a little off, but that scoring iron would score the two sides of the dado before the front iron removes the shavings. It works. You can drag the plane backwards a couple of times to score it, and then start planing forward to plane your dado, and then drag it backwards a few more times to score it a little deeper, and then plane forwards again. I always found this kind of slow and didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So my way of tuning up a dado plane is a bit unconventional, or non-traditional, if you will. I am actually going to reverse the way that this scoring iron angles. And let me get set up to do that, and then I'll show you what I mean. Okay, so what I have here is what I believe is called a jeweler's vise. It's essentially just a small metalworking vise. And I've clamped the scoring iron into it. And what you can see is this is the back of the iron here. So the iron has this angled or curved shape to allow us to drag the plane backwards to score the sides of the dado. Well, I would rather push the plane forwards. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to file these to reverse this angle. Now, these scoring irons are soft enough that you can just use a regular file to sharpen them. And that's exactly what I'm going to do here, is to reshape these into knives, essentially, that resemble a single skew or single bevel marking knife that angles away from the front, so it angles down from the front of the plane. And in my experience, shaping the irons, the scoring iron like this, allows me to use the plane in such a way that I can push to score the dado as well as remove the material all at the same time. And what I find is this tends to give me a cleaner dado cut because I'm scoring and removing the waste at the same time. So for me, when I pick up a new dado plane, this is always the first thing I do, is to reshape this scoring iron to be kind of the opposite of what it was originally. Sometimes these are ground straight across even. And what I'm looking at is I'm trying to make sure that the bevels are even, and I don't know if you can see that, but I want to make sure that one doesn't stick down farther than the other. So I've got it pretty well formed. It's not, I didn't file away this angle on the back side, but that's okay, it doesn't really matter. We're not going to use the back side. So what I want to do now is file the inside of these so that these are sharp. And you really don't want to try not to touch the outsides of these irons because that defines the width of your dado. So I'm just going to file these until I get a sharp edge, a knife edge, on that leading edge. Almost there. And I'm just going to touch it lightly to wipe the burr off. and I'll come back later, touch that up with a little diamond hone. And you can pretty much use any kind of file for this. I'm just using a tapered saw sharpening file because it's what I have that's small enough and sharp enough to get in there. But this will work just fine. Okay. And that is basically it. I'll come back and I'll touch this up and just wipe the burr off on the outside with a small diamond hone or diamond file. You can use an Arkansas slipstone or whatever you want. It's very soft steel in these scoring irons, so it doesn't really matter. You're just trying to get a knife-like edge on this leading edge so that when you push the plane, it will score the sides of the dado. The other thing you want to try to do is make sure that the tops of the two knives align. I can see these need a little bit more work, so I'm going to go ahead and do that, and I'll be right back. Okay, I've gone ahead and made sure that these two wings are even at the top, and I've reshaped them so that the leading edge is going to be the cutting edge now instead of the trailing edge. And I've gone and touched them up with a small diamond hone just to wipe the burr off and give them a nice sharp edge. So these are going to score the sides of the dado very nicely now. So now I want to turn my attention to the main cutting blade, the skewed cutting blade, and we're going to take that to the grinder. We're going to regrind the bevel, and then we're going to go to the stones and go ahead and hone that iron before we go any further. Now, before I grind the iron, I know I mentioned that I wasn't going to plane the sides of this plane because it was flat enough. One thing I have done is I have taken a smoothing plane. You can really use any plane for this, and I have trued up the bottom edge of the plane. I've made it straight, and more importantly, or most importantly, I've made it square to this side of the plane, to the outside edge of the plane, because this is going to ride against the batten or fence. So we want the bottom edge of the plane to be square to this edge when we're using the plane, and that's going to ensure that we have a nice square bottom dado. So now that the bottom edge of this plane is square, what we can do is put the iron back in. I've actually taken a dark Sharpie or some kind of dark marker and darkened the back of the blade. We can put the iron back in the plane, projecting slightly below, and we're going to true up the profile of the iron. So now the sole is square to here, and I know if the sole is square to the side of the plane, I know if I hold the plane to the batten, I should create a square dado, square bottom dado. And I can see here that the angle on this is just a little bit off. So I'm going to rescribe, transfer the sole, the angle of the sole onto the blade. And I'm going to take this over to the grinder and go ahead and fix this edge and regrind the bevel. So I'm going to start by grinding straight in to fix my edge. Now you can see the scribe line I've got on here, and I'm using that as a guide. And I just rest the blade on top of the tool rest, and I'm going to blunt the edge until I'm even with that scribe line. Now we'll cool the edge in a little bit of water, and I'm going to grind following this skew angle, because these blades have a skew angle to them. I don't want to grind that bevel. I don't want to hold the blade straight up and down like I would for a bench plane iron or other iron that has a straight angle. I need to push the blade into the grinding stone at the skew angle. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to hold the blade at the skew angle and gently grind. And I'm not using a lot of pressure here. I'm just barely touching the grinding stone. The more pressure you use, the more likely the stone is going to heat up the steel and burn the steel. When it starts to get warm, I dunk it in a little bit of water, cool it down, then I can go back to the stone. I'm using a fairly coarse grinding stone. This is a 46 grit wheel. The coarser the wheel you can use, the faster you will grind and the cooler you will grind. It's also important to keep the stone dressed. Use a diamond dressing tool and keep the face of that stone clean and keep it with a slight crown on it. If your blade starts to get hot or things seem to cut slow, your wheel most likely needs to be dressed. Notice I keep looking at the tip of the blade. What I'm looking for is the reflection of the lights off of the very tip. It's not going to pick it up in the camera, but if I can see light, I know that I haven't ground all the way to that edge yet. An edge that's been fully ground should not reflect any light. If I look down at this edge and I see a reflection of light, I know that spot has not been ground fully yet. And contrary to what many folks would recommend, I grind right to the edge. By using a coarse wheel, a light touch, keeping the stone dressed, and quenching in water, I don't have to worry about burning. And I haven't overheated or blued an edge since I started learning how to use the grinder. Now after grinding, I'm going to hone the edge, lap the back and hone the edge. And I've moved my sharpening setup over here to the bench, just to the workbench from my sharpening bench, just so it's easier for you to see what I'm doing. I start off on a coarse diamond. This is a DMT Dia-Sharp coarse. I don't know exactly what grit that is, but it's a coarse stone, somewhere around probably 220 or 320 or something like that. I don't like coarse water stones because they go out of flat much too fast, and even oil stones, coarse ones, tend to cut kind of slow. They do fine on this old cast steel, but I'm using a lot more modern steels these days in a lot of my tools, and the oil stones will work. They just tend to work a little bit slower on the harder, more abrasion-resistant modern steels. So I've gone back to using water stones, and we're almost there. You can see a little spot here where I'm not quite flat yet. Okay, that's good. Okay, I will say I do really like these Sigma water stones. They do cut extremely fast in the old cast steel. 6 passes you just saw there. on a 1200 grit stone, and I'm ready to move on to the next one. They're super fast. Unfortunately, I understand they're having problems getting these stones, so not sure if you can still get them or not. So now comes the part of tuning the plane that can be the most fun. It can also be the most frustrating. The blade's sharp, the scoring iron's sharp, everything's put back together, the sole's flat. So we're sure that the plane body is ready to go and that the blades should be ready to go. I've put the blades back in the plane. I haven't bothered to set the depth stop because it's not necessary for this step of the process. When I put the blades back in the plane, I want to make sure that the scoring iron, that the blades actually extend beyond the sides of the plane. Now here, I'm not quite sure that they totally do. We're going to find out in a second. I may, just from sighting down the plane, it's hard to tell. I may have to adjust the sides of this plane a little bit narrower, because if the stock is wider than the blade, it's going to bind. It's not going to work well. So we'll see when we do the test cut. But I've got the scoring iron centered so that the sides of the scoring iron should be cutting just outside of the wooden part of the plane. I've also got the main blade set so that when you sight down the plane, you should be able to see the blade through or between the scoring iron. So if you look between the scoring iron, you should see both sides of the main cutting blade. If you don't, if it looks like one side or the other of the main cutting blade is sticking out past the scoring iron, you're going to need to address that. You might need to readjust the plane in the body, or what the test cut will hopefully tell us, we may need to go back to the grinder and actually make the main cutting iron a little thinner. But let's try test cut first. Okay, so I've gone and nailed a fence to my board, and this is a traditional way of holding the fence to the board for a dado, because typically it's on the inside of a case and the nail holes won't be seen anyway after things are assembled. So I've nailed the fence to make sure it won't move, and I've also used a couple of hold fast just to hold my board to the bench, and we're going to give our plane a try. Okay, so the plane didn't bind, which is good, but what I am seeing is, if we look at the dado that it made here, there's a slight, very slight bit of jaggedness along the outside edge. Now what that tells me is that the sides of this blade, of the main blade, are catching on the outside edge of the dado. You can even see there's a couple spots where it's torn. So what it's telling me is that the outside edges of this main cutting blade are catching and scraping the outsides as after the scoring blade passes. So unfortunately what that means is we're going to have to grind down the edge, the outside edges of this blade just a little bit. It's not that big of a deal, and you don't need, judging by how this is tearing, the tearing's not too bad, so I shouldn't have to grind too much. So it's back to the grinder to grind the outside edge. Now each time that you grind the side of the iron, just take a tiny little bit off, put it back in the plane, and make another test cut. And continue that way until you get the dado nice and clean. You don't want to take too much off of the sides of the main cutting iron because you'll leave material unremoved in the bottom of the dado, and then you'll have to clean that up with another tool, and that's not what we're looking for. So you want to just take off tiny bits of material off the side of the iron at a time and continue to test it each time you do so. Now, once you do get it, whether it takes you 2, 3, or 4 times, get that blade back in your plane, get yourself set up for another test cut, and you'll find that once you get it, you'll be able to make clean, smooth dados that in most woods are almost effortless.